Our last speaker from the panelists is Deborah Coles, who is joining us from the UK. And, in your work, one of the interesting things that you bring is this nexus of the prison state complex, the prison private actor state complex, which we need to also to understand whether we find that in history, in the origins of mandatory detention. Do you have stories that you could be able to give us? But also, I think in your work, you have surfaced questions of extreme representation of very racialized indigenous communities in the criminal justice system. And I think, we would like also to hear from you about how, same systems of racialized criminal justice system is applied in the immigration detention system, as well as the mental health of the people you have worked with, because your experience is very rich in that area. So over to you, Deborah. You have 10 minutes as well.
Thank you, and great presentation so far. Hello, everybody. Blair Peach was killed by a police officer on a protest against the far-right National Front. Omasasi Lumumba, an asylum seeker, killed after being restrained by prison officers. Gareth Myatt, restrained by G4S guards in a child prison. Sarah Reed, with a long history of mental ill health, died in prison awaiting psychiatric reports. Some of the names of the men, women and children who have died, whose families Inquest have worked with over the past 4 decades. And we examine these deaths in mandatory detention in a broader social, economic and political context. And like others have said, I need to recognize the impact of colonialism, white supremacy, enslavement, and the history of genocide, torture and brutality of the British state, which developed repressive forms of social control reliant on racist attitudes against colonialized people. In the UK, this legacy can be seen in the forms of racist state practices that also had their roots in the policing and genocide of Irish people, in mass incarceration, the domestic policing of Black British people, the targeting of Muslim communities, and the criminalization of migrants. Places of incarceration, prisons, immigration centres, and mental health and learning disability settings contain the most powerful, most powerless, and marginalised people. As the grandmother of Emily Hartley, a young woman who took her life in prison, said, Emily was sent to prison after she had a psychotic episode and set fire to herself, her mattress and curtains. There are many others who find it hard to cope with an illness. They need care and support, not a prison sentence. The war on crime, the criminalization of drugs, mental health, homelessness, poverty, the war on terror and the hostile environment, racism and patriarchy, and the impact of poverty and austerity, and now COVID, are current examples of a long-standing process of social abjection in which certain groups of people are positioned as others, as disposable, as less than human, reinforcing and reproducing the inequalities of power along gender, race, class, and disability lines. Black people in the UK are at the sharp end of a continuum of over-policing, criminalisation, incarceration, and surveillance. An Inquest has documented the disproportionate number of Black men of African and Caribbean heritage who die following the use of lethal force by state agents, and shows what happens when racial stereotyping is institutionalized in policy and practice that equates Black people with dangerousness and criminality. Language used by state agents when challenged to defend their action reproduce those very myths and stereotypes that legitimized colonialism, with reference to superhuman strength and unpredictability to legitimize violent and deadly policing. In the same way that Black women in prison are seen as difficult, as a control problem, and have died from neglect by prison and healthcare staff under the guise that they are faking it. The prison population in the UK has risen by over 69% in the last 30 years, despite no link between the prison population and crime levels. And in 1988, the prison population was 65,000. Today it is 81,500. The rate of deaths have almost doubled in the last decades. And over the last 10 years, there have been 2,804 deaths, of which 854 are self-inflicted, and many others that could have been prevented with better healthcare. People from Black or minoritized communities account for 25% of the prison population and over 50% of children and young people in prison. Black people are also disproportionately detained in mental health settings, and people in mental health and learning disability settings experience high levels of restraint and seclusion. Incarceration is now part of a global business, overlapping interests of government and industry, the steady succession of private companies through the doors of prisons, immigration centres and mental health settings, leading to ever more complex chains of accountability. The increased outsourcing of state responsibility to corporate global giants like G4S, who despite shocking deaths and other contract failures, still get awarded new contracts. One of those who died was Jimmy Mabenga, an Angolan man being deported on a BA flight, killed after being forcibly restrained and asphyxiated by G4S guards. Witnesses described him begging for help and saying that he couldn't breathe over 50 times. The inquiry into his death revealed a culture of racism and violence towards detainees, a catalogue of complaints about the use of excessive force and the pursuit of profit, where G4S paid staff only on completion of a successful deportation. He left behind 5 children. His death took place in the context of the UK's so-called hostile environment and the Windrush scandal that saw so many people who had lived in the UK for many decades wrongly detained, deported and denied legal rights. There have been 58 deaths of immigration detainees since 2000, and earlier this year saw an inquest jury condemn the dehumanizing treatment of Prince Fosu, a Ghanaian man with a psychotic illness left to die from hypothermia, dehydration and malnourishment, naked in insanitary conditions in a GEO group run detention center. Detention, transportation and deportation are not about people, but objects, not welfare, but the pursuit of profit, racial capitalism with echoes of the slave trade. No coincidence, as others have said, that the 2 countries that founded their wealth on the slave trade have the highest incarceration rates. Inquest tells the human stories of those who die, amplify those voices and those of their families to challenge the narratives that too often attempt to deny, demonize and victim blame those who have died, to deflect attention from the state or corporate conduct. Our work has ensured that a more searching set of questions have been raised about deaths and helped to shine a light behind closed places of detention on violence and ill treatment, neglect, racism, sexism, indifference, and systemic failings. Bereaved families and communities have become powerful advocates and activists for change, turning their grief into resistance and action against injustice. Inquest supports their struggles and campaigns to provide a counterweight to state secrecy and a lack of real accountability, and have played a critical role in challenging the unacceptable practices of the state. And it is this resistance that has seen uprisings and protests across the country in response to deaths from the early 80s when Inquest was set up to the present, many of which were subject to police and undercover surveillance. From the 20,000 black people who marched on Parliament after the New Cross fire in 1981, after a suspected racist attack saw 13 young people burned to death, and a bungled police investigation that treated families like suspects more than victims, to uprisings in communities that have continued over the decades in response to deaths, and sees a yearly procession of families to Parliament. Many of these campaigns have seen legal, social and political progress. The UK has one of the most developed frameworks for oversight of places of detention, yet an appalling record of accountability and a culture of impunity and immunity. There is a shameful failure to enact change in response to recommendations from inquiries into deaths. From the failure to respect the right to life and dignity and respect is born another failure to uphold the right to truth and justice. Hence the importance of Inquest work in empowering and humanizing people to break this cycle of marginalization and impunity, to try and create the cultural and political will to make human rights meaningful and not illusory. This is about radical, transformative structural change and solutions, looking beyond mandatory detention and law enforcement, and rethinking how we address societal harms and racial and social inequalities that prioritize people's needs and invests in communities. The last words I'll give to Marcia Rigg, a formidable family campaigner whose brother Sean died after being restrained by police officers when in a mental health crisis 10 years ago. We have to cling on to hope, otherwise they've won indefinitely, and that cannot be right because the evidence is so compelling. It's traumatizing for any family, and I don't think that ever goes away. We understand our loved ones will never come back. What we want is for it to not happen to another family. What we want is really effective change. Thank you.